Hello, we are the Association for Child and Adolescent Mental Health, or ACAM for short.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar given by ACAM, the Association of Child and Adolescent Mental Health. The theme this evening is the response of the Association of Family Therapy, supporting hosts of Ukrainian families. And our two presenters are Kate Daniels, who a systemic psychotherapist who was for many years a trainer at the Tavistock Clinic and is now a senior lecturer at Salomons Institute of Applied Psychology, which is in Tunbridge, I think. And she's going to describe the response of the Association of Family Therapy to support the hosts of Ukrainian families. She was prompted by the huge response to displaced Ukrainians coming to the UK in April, and she placed an advert in the Association of Family Therapy's newsletter to explore the possibility of members of the association volunteering their systemic skills to support refugee agencies in the tremendous work they were doing to help refugees settle and feel welcomed in this country. Over 160 AFT members responded to the request. The initial aim was to prepare hosts and offer support, reducing the risk of arrangements breaking down. And of course, Kate would like to think that this approach is going to be valuable for support work with refugees from all countries. So she's going to describe the development of this approach and the response over the period and the workshops which have developed. Julie Riley is a systemic and family psychotherapist who's currently working as part of the therapeutic services team at the Refugee Council. She's worked across many different contexts, public, private, and statutory contexts. She's interested in organizational development and how people are influenced by systems and can influence change in systems. Working with in Relate, an organization I was president of once some years ago, and interested in the issue of dealing with violence against children in context of family violence. And she's very much now moving into this field, working with the Refugee Council with asylum seekers who've been placed in London hotels and in the Kent barrack facilities, and is part of the group supporting hosts. So this is such an important and topical theme, and we've all read accounts of the period approaching 6 months and the challenge for families in terms of how the future is going to look, and the many stresses and concerns about Ukrainian families here, as well, of course, as our reading every day of what's actually happening in Ukraine. And our hearts go out to the many families who are subject to the sort of horrors of war and the stresses associated. I'd very much like to invite you to use the chat to introduce yourselves, and please use the Q&A, which you'll find at the bottom of the window, to put some questions in, because we hope that at the end of the presentation that Kate and Julie will be able to pick up some of the questions and issues which you are raising and thinking about the future. So, Kate, could I introduce you to start?
Thank you, Anne, and hello everybody, and welcome from ours. I'm very grateful to Anne and the association for inviting us to come and do this presentation. The project is something very close to our hearts. Julie's been my comrade in arms from the start of this project, when we delivered the first workshop to hosts in Canterbury, and that was in April. And we've accumulated more and more experience as time's gone by, and we've run more workshops. So we're both delighted to have this opportunity. And it is heartwarming and encouraging that there are so many of you interested in attending. But I did wonder if it also speaks to the huge level of concern that's abroad at the moment, abroad around, in terms of the future of the Homes for Ukraine service and the potential for, well, first of all, the potential for many Ukrainian families to become homeless, but also something else which I think is really important, which is the undermining of that incredibly generous impulse of hosts to open their homes and now maybe want to reclaim them after 6 months and actually don't feel that they know how to manage this or how to do it when the resources are not there and available. There is not a roadmap for them, that there hasn't been a plan set out for this by the government. So it's a difficult time. What I'm going to do is take you on a swift Cook's tour through the motivation and the development of the project. Some of the things we've learned. I'll talk to you first about the themes that we decided to address in our early workshops. These have developed since then. And I'm going to give you show you some slides that are examples of how the workshops went. And I'll also talk with you a little bit about the themes that came up in those workshops and give you some examples of things people were saying and some of the issues that we were addressing. And Julie will chip in, I dare say, but I'm also going to hand you over to her to talk more specifically about the operation of the project in Kent. I want to say I've left my email address on the first slide I'm going to show you, and I think it might be on the last as well. And I'd really welcome hearing from any of you who are interested in more information or would like us to get involved, run a workshop in your area perhaps. And we have plans for our next steps. We want to think about offering workshops to refugee agencies. We want to become really part of a network, what I call a community of support, rather than disparate little projects. And we also hope to set up Zoom drop-ins for hosts, and maybe subsequently for refugees. As Arnon said, we started with quite a limited and specific brief. It felt very important just to make it a doable thing. But we really hope to develop, and although this was, the impetus was the Ukrainian issue and the war, really our concern is for the refugees from all over the world. So we're seeking funding now for project managers to take the project forward. So if you've got any suggestions, put them in the chat, and do ask, as Anna said, do ask questions and comment in the chat. That will be, they will be very welcome. We'll keep an eye on those. I'm going to share my screen with you now. And systemic support for those displaced by war and oppression. I've got a fancy sort of thing happening where there's my email address, by the way. I want to briefly look at how the project developed. I've explained this to you. I'm going to sort of not shoot through too slowly because we are limited with time. So the impetus for this, well, as with many of you recognise, a lot of this comes from our own heritage, our own experiences, and part of that I think was very much mine. But I had a really very strong desire to support the initiatives of kindness that had started this whole issue of hosting families up. And I was concerned that with more breakdown of these, that kind of othering that can happen in a society where communities feel under threat from other things, from poverty, from illness, there is sometimes a disposition towards othering, not wanting other people in and feeling very protective for whatever reason. And so it seemed very important to really support that initiative of compassion and kindness to try and make it work. Also, I had a desire to make the scope and influence of our systemic ideas more widely available. I've put Frontline 19 here because I volunteered, I was a therapist with Frontline 19. I've also put Helen Bamber down because both of these inspired me massively to recognize that you can make things happen when they're needed. You can introduce change without it having to be a massive, scaffolded organizational enterprise. Frontline 19, for those of, I'm sure most of you know, it's a voluntary, it's run to supply mental health support, counselling, psychotherapy for people in the health services and support workers. And it was set up during lockdown. And again, happened like that from in a small way, and it's grown massively. Helen Bamber, I worked for the Medical Foundation in the late 80s when she was just getting started. We had premises in the Temperance Hospital in few rooms in Euston. She was just getting started running the Medical Foundation for the care of victims of torture. And it got embedded and it became a huge support network. So that inspired me to think, yes, we can do something. We can do something, hence the notion that it's better to light one candle than to curse the darkness, which is a sort of bit of an anthem of mine. You can do one small thing. So how did I think our field could work in this? I'm really sorry that I'm being so hopeless with my mouse. I've just realized. Now look, here's a really important quote from Judith Herman from her book Trauma and Recovery. Repeatedly in the testimony of survivors, there comes the moment when a sense of connection is restored by another person's unaffected display of generosity. Something in herself that the victim believes to be irretrievably destroyed, that is, faith, decency, courage, is reawakened by an example of common altruism. Mirrored in the actions of others, the survivor recognizes and reclaims a lost part of herself. At that moment, the survivor begins to rejoin the human commonality. That really, really lovely quote from Judith Herman that I wanted to say, again, supports this idea that if we can help to support people's acts of kindness, it's a way of bringing forth more. It's a way of helping create contexts that bring forth more of that. So that thinking about these kinds of relationships between the person who is struggling, the survivor, and the person who's offering the kindness. Now, why systemic psychotherapists? Here are just some very quickly, some ideas about our work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with already. Typically, we work with families and communities. We work with relationships. We are working all the time interrelationally. To us, one of the kind of keystones of our work is thinking about the multiple contexts that inform what's going on for people, how they experience themselves. And in that respect, you know, culture is a massive, massive context. So a lot of us work cross-culturally. We're interested in exploring connections, how they work, how they don't work, but also what helps them work. And we're interested in the idea of difference. So how difference impacts and informs the way systems interact. So different beliefs, different cultural attitudes. We're also a strengths-based approach. We like to bring forth strengths and resources. That is not to say that we're not conscious and aware of struggles and vulnerabilities. But we assume that people bring within them the certain capacities that just need the right context to help those grow, develop. I'm sure you'll understand what I mean by that. So here, when we talk about cross-cultural work, I just wanted to add these because it's about being curious. I'm just trying to move this about difference again. And how we wanted to think about host families and the difference, what happened to them, and what the differences were that they were having to be negotiated between host families that were offering to open their homes and those people who were struggling to find homes and safety and security. So this felt important to us. So striving for cultural competence with refugees generally means recognizing, if you like, that distress can be displayed differently across cultures, and equally help seeking may take a different form, and beliefs about health may differ from those in the dominant culture. So these were things we were alert to, and I think it felt terribly important to us to help families who are going to host, be hosts, recognize and be able to investigate difference from a safe and very uncritical position. So one of our aims was to help that happen a bit. So what we do, we try to support that unaffected display of generosity that Judith Herman referred to, and help to create communities of support. Contexts that enhance safe, secure bases for refugees, such as the Ukrainians in this first instance. So how we do that. As Anand said, I drew on our organisation and advertised, and yes, got over 160 replies from people all over the country. What maybe you need to know is that a large proportion of systemic psychotherapists work in the health service. And it seems to me that that's they are not very visible in there. Often it's a tier 4 service. They're not very visible. Our work is not very visible, what we do. And it really felt important to bring that out and work in a much more visible way. And I think our colleagues, maybe Julie will probably recognise this as well, wanted to have that opportunity to come and do some voluntary work. So although many of them are working full time and many of them have families, they volunteered. And what we've ended up with, I realised very quickly that services were being set up variously around the country, very differently around the country. So, and they were very local. So it seemed important to set up local communities of support. So we've got 17 teams. And in Northern Ireland, Northern Ireland has been a great asset because of the wealth of experience they bring in terms of working with trauma. So my brief to these teams was to liaise, to create a liaison with refugee agencies, resettlement officers in their area, and to offer these workshops to hosts. It was felt important to limit the brief to working with hosts. We have been asked to work with families, and some of us have done that. I have done that. Others are doing that. But it felt important. I think what you probably need to know is that if people have been working in institutions, to come out of those institutions and to work, as it were, freelance in small teams, it's a very new experience. And I didn't want to set something up that was too ambitious and was going. So it was about slow steps. So working with hosts was the first step, and it was to help them prepare for the role of hosting, to help them through the different stages of hosting with specific issues, trauma, children, communication, culture. And to, most importantly, to offer this uncritical space for them to meet, to share, to consider their experiences. And that's been hugely important for them. They have, in a world where we're ever more being asked to consider ourselves as individuals rather communities, it's been really important for them to share that sense of community with each other. Let me say, though, that this is not just about talking together. We did feel it was important to offer them some psychoeducation, to provide information for them. They wanted it, tips, advice. So I'm just going to then, let me just remember which way it's. This is the list that we sent out in our information leaflet, what we were offering. creating helpful boundaries and house rules, thinking about the challenges, understanding working with cultural and family differences, thinking about communication, thinking about different parenting styles, again, in the context of culture. That's been a big one. That'll come up later, and I imagine Julie might speak to that as well. Very much thinking about the needs of children in the joint household, you know, how that again is negotiated, thought about. Looking after yourself, you know, one host said to one of my colleagues in a group, "This is my place to come for some self-care." That felt quite important. I think one of the things we realized at the outset, that the most important thing was to stop resentments building up, to have ways, helping people have ways of talking, understanding, negotiating, that would allow things to be resolved before they blew up. So I'm going to show you some examples of our slides with the themes and information, the ideas that we present for consideration. Every aspect in our workshop is an invitation for discussion, and they join in. The hosts really appreciate and enjoy that. We always invite them to create WhatsApp groups, and you know, part of our project is to help them sustain each other. And another part of our project is to normalise the struggles they describe, and so to undermine their feelings of embarrassment and shame, because those are big. I'll give you an example of some of the things we've had to think about with people in that respect. I'll shoot through these examples. So it seemed important. Here's a context: our relationship to helpfulness. What does it mean to be helpful? One of the things in our world, is systemic world, is to be prepared to deconstruct meanings with families and family members, and not to assume that we know or understand what they mean by certain words. So the word helpfulness felt very important to deconstruct, because they all wanted to be helpful, but they all had their own beliefs and ideas of what it meant to be helpful. So we wanted to introduce new lenses to allow them to investigate that think about their beliefs about what it means to be helpful. I'll come back to that because it's very interesting. You know, I've done run workshops in London, and I've also done here in the country, and what people's ideas are about what it means to be helpful, very different, very different. So here's one of the first slides that we show, which is really, I mean, partly, if you like, it's about how we help people think about their relationship to help differently by thinking about what they're helping their guests to do. And this idea of helping their guests to reclaim their lives and their dignity seemed terribly important, because our concern was that helping didn't become an overwhelming one-way street, as if one was accommodating someone who had no kind of will or life source of their own, life force. So that felt very important, to help them think about what's that issue of dignity and how they help people reclaim their dignity.
And Kate, can I just chip in there? I know you gave me an invitation to chip in, so I will occasionally. I was just thinking about some of the hosts when we first put up that slide, and subsequently you know, their own family scripts and stories about being helpful. And I don't know, you know, everyone listening, you know, if you have somebody coming to stay at home, how do you do the kind of the looking after of the guest, the helpfulness, and, you know, stories of, you know, doing everything for everybody and not feeling able to kind of step back. And then I think those conversations, as you said, were really, really important. And I think there's the slide, that it was about not doing to people, allowing people to have their space and their dignity to live their lives as best they can, whilst being a guest, and for the host family to keep their family, the wheels going in their family as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. So here, I sort of took, sorry, I didn't mean to bring it up so quickly, but I'm not very good with my mouse. So we talked about doing with rather than doing to. I'm sure that's something you're very familiar with, all of you. And I guess the terms that I chose to privilege were consult, collaborate, and negotiate. Recognizing, that these are people who've had busy, rich lives, and they're more than displaced people or refugees. We would call that a very thin description, a displaced person or a refugee. So something about being interested in their lives in other ways, and collaboration, allowing for a more reciprocal relationship. So again, this issue of undermining the potential for challenges, resentments that may appear out of nowhere. We'll talk about that a little further in terms of trauma. So the idea of being able to adapt, being helpful. Another idea is that when you're in that one-way stream of one person helping and the other person being grateful, it's an extremely limiting relationship and it's exhausting. No one can keep it up. So consulting guests, deferring to their own expertise about their own family restores their dignity. For people, maybe this feels like it's just common sense to you, but I think as Julie's indicated, it felt like a really important triggers for conversations. Example of material. No, this is a second. So this was this theme about what does it mean to help someone feel psychologically safe? And guess what we invoked for that? We invoked Maslow's hierarchy of need, and talking about psychological safety. So that was a little bit of the people we've worked with have enjoyed some of this information, and it's provided a good bedrock for conversation. Oh, there I go, on again. So, I mean, here are some themes that came up in relation to psychological safety. Let me first say that almost to a person, the hosts we've met with have found it difficult to talk about imposing boundaries and rules, haven't they?
Yeah.
And you can understand why. They're bringing people into their homes who've had terrible experiences. You don't bring them in and say, right, now I just want you to know that you can't use this cupboard. That's your space in the fridge. Please make sure the door's locked if you go, all that. So they end up just kind of make this your home. Well, it's absolutely fraught with difficulties. And I have to say, I did one workshop where one host family actually wrote, they were in communication by email to their guests, and wrote to them the house rules and said, what do you think about this? This is what we've done. What do you think? Come back to us. So they set up the negotiation very early on. Not everyone has been able to do that. So we had to talk about that, but we also had to give them a rationale for having boundaries. And this is one of them, about psychological safety, so that their guests don't have to go around feeling that they're in an unsafe environment where if they don't work out the rules, they might get thrown out, So being clear with them felt like a very important. So clarity, route to psychological safety. Structure. So this was something about making sure that although you were there for them as needs be, keeping the wheels of everyday life moving would be a help for them, rather than turning your whole life upside down. Come on, my little wheel. Right, listening. Let me just tell you that before we set these slides up, I did speak with a colleague, a systemic colleague who had begun hosting, and she talked to me about some of the difficulties and some of the things that they had felt were really important that had come up. And so some of these slides were put together with some guidance from conversations like that. I mean, this is self-explanatory. Don't get again, these were early days, and we did ask them to recognize their own boundaries and to avoid being overwhelmed, because trauma is contagious, can be contagious. Example of material 3, trauma. So we felt we needed to give them some information about trauma. I know this is an area that Anna and you work with a lot, but we wanted to give them some information because the word trauma is used all over the place these days, and it can be very much misused. So we wanted to talk to them about trauma. Oh God. And give them some understanding of it, because they needed to recognize the differences with what they might be dealing with. So these were I'm assuming you're going to have these slides made available to you, but and I'm sure you're already, this is material that you're probably, many of you, very familiar with. So we talked about how trauma can manifest. This was part of preparing them and helping them talk about some of their experiences of their guests. We talked about common reactions well, these have developed actually. So this is since the first set of slides. And babies and toddlers, preschool children, and all of these have come up from hosts in workshops I've done. That felt something important to talk about with them. And then we talked about recovery. You know, some of us ran 2 or 3 workshops covering these, doing an introductory workshop and then covering these in subsequent workshops. I don't know, Julie, you've done that and you're going to talk a bit. Are you going to talk a bit?
Yeah.
So to material 4, children, goodness me, if you, I've got some examples, but the kind of parental impetus that a lot of hosts took on when they entered into this arrangement was kind of interesting, and maybe grandparental, you know, they wanted really to help with the children. So we wanted to help them think about the parental issue of parental authority. The idea of not relying on the children, again, back to consulting and collaborating. That's what we wanted, to invite them to hold that in mind. So something about letting them know, you know, that their parents were being supported. And also kind of slowing down the process so that to allow and explain to the children each step of the way, to begin with, what was happening while they were at school, so they can to reassure and to know. Example of material 5, communication. This is a very early slide on communication. We went into communication language in more depth. Communication was a really interesting one. It came up a lot. I don't know. It looked as though, at least I saw one person who joined and said hello on the chat, who is actually hosting. And it'd be interesting to know what your view is. But a lot of people we've spoken with, and I don't know about you, Julie, but a lot of people I've spoken with have found the different styles, cultural styles of communication, interesting and sometimes challenging.
Yeah.
So when we've talked about boundaries, I remember one man saying, well, I'll explain to them gradually the boundaries. And so I said, well, can you just tell me how you put it? And he went into this really lengthy, very English way of explaining, and I didn't know what he meant. And I said, gosh, that sounds quite complicated. And what a lot of the hosts have said is that their guests are very direct and just say, say things as they need to be said. And this circumlocutory style of polytest that is very common in this country, just kind of they didn't understand. So there's very interesting. Have you come across that, Julie? Is that what
and I was just on some of the chat. I mean, that's sparked quite a response in terms of, you know, we've got the English language you know, kind of dilemma and communicating via Google Translate, but then you've got the how, you know, when I've worked with host families on one-to-one consultations, it's how to have those conversations when you don't want your guests to feel rejected, you don't want them to feel bad. So, you know, we can go around the houses or avoid those conversations. And equally, Ukrainian families have talked about not really kind of understanding or being confused. And Anastasia, who we work with very much in Canterbury, who is Ukrainian herself, you know, just keep banging on and on with us going, be direct, be direct, be direct, because that's how communication happens between Ukrainian people, and that's how they understand it. But that can be really difficult, and particularly if you're wanting to change things. You're direct and kind, somebody said, kind being the operative word, I think. But you know and it can be particularly difficult if, you know, for host families, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, if actually their needs aren't being met in the relationship or their family, you know, something's happening for them. So yeah.
Yes.
Just a comment. It's a call a spade a bloody spade. That's it. I don't know if I know David, if he's a Canterbury person, but yeah.
Themes. I want to move. Just quickly talk about themes because I want to hand over to you, Julie. So we've talked about communication style, childcare. Really, really interesting. The childcare differences. Gosh, I had you know, one woman who said the children go to bed at the same time as the adults, it would seem. That's what we've been told. That's what I've been told by a lot of the hosts. I don't know what those, I see that there are lots of you here who are hosting. So one woman who said, oh God, I had to say in the end to my mother, my guest, please, I don't mind if they don't go to bed, but could you just ask them to be in their room after 8 o'clock or something like that? And the mother did that, and it was a nice transaction. I think they became quite close, the guest and the mother and the host. And then the mother started doing that and started sitting downstairs with her host and saying, I rather like this English idea of putting the children to bed a bit earlier. So they enjoyed that kind of story. Another childcare story, it was of a local village where I did a workshop, where one local village woman who was kind of responsible in the way they often are in rural areas, felt responsible for a lot of what was going on in the village and connecting up the hosts, spoke in a very outraged way about one Ukrainian mother allowing her child, a young child, to cross a busy road. And I was working there with a Ukrainian psychotherapist who said, but you don't understand, children are given a lot more responsibility earlier on in our country. So these differences and that seem to be very important, and back to, you know, how you talk about them, how you are interested in them rather than judging them, seemed important for us to think about. I'm really very concerned about the 6-month term and nowhere for guests to go, and I see one or two of you have mentioned that in the chat, and I wanted to invite you to get in touch if you want, because one idea that a local area has come up with is setting up respite hosting arrangements. I want to talk about that so that your guests can maybe go somewhere for a week for respite for them and for you. I think dignity and shame are very important issues. We meet all the time hosts feeling ashamed that they are struggling And as I've already said, we really, really try to manage that and undermine it and normalize the struggle. And sometimes when they feel the shame, they won't talk about things, and then communication doesn't happen. Variability of connection. Guests have been, I don't know if those of you who are hosting have found this, fixed to their phone. They want to know what's going on, the news, the media. Urban versus rural, very different services. I ran a workshop for Lewisham hosts where one situation was breaking down because the mother was on the phone, so distressed and distraught and on the phone, trying to keep track of what was going on in her neighbourhood. And the young mother, who was the host, and was a mother herself, was looking after her guests' children, and she built up resentment, but she couldn't communicate it. She found she was too anxious, felt too ashamed about the resentment. So in the end, she emailed her guest, and then that caused a problem. Now it was Lewisham. Lewisham is a London borough very used to working with asylum seekers, and they have a mediation services and they have support workers. So this situation got looked at immediately and they got a lot of help with it. And in our meetings, there was a lot of conversation, and she got support. She and her husband got support and from sharing and talking. But she said, I felt so ashamed that I was not coping and that I should be looking after these children. So there we are. There we are. Tension the hosts struggle with around degrees of support they should be offering. That's the tension. And when to ask for help, responding to distress signals, another thing that's come up time and again. Here we are, my examples. That's all I've just told you about. I think I've told you about all of these. Oh, and then the degree of support you should be giving. A host who was taking her guest children to school every day one day said to the hosting organizer, is it all right for me to go back to work? I really need to be at work. I've taken time off work to do this. And the organizer said, but you shouldn't have been doing it anyway, you know. So the degree, again, back to relationship to help and what it means to be helpful. We had a host who said, I don't let anyone use my kitchen, and she seemed perfectly happy to cook meals for her guests and everybody else. So they all ate one meal together. I've said something here about sometimes it's the less obvious distress signals that are harder to address and that one has to keep track of carefully. I think children who don't go to school, you can understand that and work with it. I was thinking about that reaction to trauma, which can be sitting and staring at the wall kind of trauma, being very quiet, being remote. Oh yes, nervous of setting boundaries. One woman who was hosting on her own, a mother and 3 children, she came down to her kitchen one day, found them all on their phone, different stations in Russian, all having breakfast, and she left to go upstairs to her own bedroom to have some space to herself. And halfway up the stairs, she thought, this isn't right. So she kind of steeled herself and went downstairs and very graciously said, look, I do need to come into the kitchen and be in the kitchen. Can you And again, it was negotiated. So interesting. I think the matter of children being anxiously responsible in our field, we sometimes call it parentified, trying to step into their absent father's shoes. In one case we came across, being very responsible, being very anxious in their own way, keeping an eye on their parent all the time to take their cues from their parent. I'm sure you know this, I just wanted to run this so you'll have this if you're interested. I wish I could, I'm sure Julie can tell you. It's not Dennis, but the Ukrainian psychiatrist that...
Dennis Ugin.
Dennis Ugin is another person, yeah. The reason I'm suggesting, if any of you do want to get in touch about specific support, we do have resources in different parts of the country. And for those of you who are hosting, we do also have access to some Ukrainian-speaking psychotherapists, psychologists who I've been responsible for training, and do get in touch if you feel the need. So we'd like to try and be able to help if we can. Now I'm going to hand you over to Julie.
So, yeah, I guess what I'm going to do is really talk about the ideas that Kate's talked about and our rationale and the underpinning of why we wanted to do this work. I'm going to talk about really what we've been doing in Kent. And as Kate said, I was very lucky to be alongside her to deliver the first workshop in Canterbury in April. I also want to say that I am not alone in Kent as the family therapist. I've got a lovely team, Emma Dunton and Samantha Stokes. And I think Emma's actually in the audience. So thanks, Emma. That's it. So what I'm going to do is actually describe briefly what the workshop is about. And really what I want you to know is the workshop has driven everything that we have done in Kent. It's been a really kind of foundational piece of work, and it has changed. It's evolved as we've got feedback from hosts, and they've talked about what they've wanted. We have evolved it. So I think this is a really live document, and you know, I think that's where it needs to be. So really, the workshop content, what we deliver, covers the host family life. And by that I mean, and Kate's talked about it, about some of the what is, and one host said it really nicely, what do I want my guests to know about my family? What's important to us in our family, and how do we communicate that to our guests? And how do we want to receive our guests with all those ideas of them being able to live their lives, drawing on their resiliences and resources. And as Kate said, that was really, really tricky for people because putting in rules and putting in boundaries, and I don't know if it's the language of rule or boundaries, just felt really, really complicated. However, when we started talking about it with them, host families did identify actually that there were some really important things about how they lived their lives that they wanted to continue with. And, you know, like one couple talked about it being really, really important that the TV is off after 9 o'clock, you know, and how is that communicated to a family? So even though it felt quite an uncomfortable conversation to be having, first of all, about kind of, it felt quite impositional, imposing something, you know, through conversation, I think it really highlighted that actually, you know, we do have needs as a host family, and you know, we need to be real about that. Communication, you know, I've put it there as a subtitle, but actually for me, communication just kind of, you know, embraces everything in the workshop. And many hosts talked about communication and really drawing on their own experiences, being children in their own families, what happens with them, as often being you know, it can be quite difficult to communicate around your own needs. You know, if there are things that are not working well, how we talk about that. So very much the workshop also centered around how we might have those conversations, and just kind of being able to be vulnerable in those workshops was really important. And we had a couple of host families really talk about the benefit of being part of the workshop and being able to be vulnerable and saying, I'm finding this difficult, you know, and then we all work together to think about how that conversation might take place. And in fact, one of the families came back to a second workshop, which was the same as the first workshop, because they had another dilemma they wanted to talk about. So there's lots of space in the workshop for host families to talk about what's going on for them. We then focus in on parents and children, as Kate said, and I'll talk about it a little bit later on, but I think that one of the really important discussions that takes place is around allowing guest family parenting to, for them to remain the parents. And I know, and I've seen in the some of the chat that's come up, issues around safeguarding, issues around differences, and the impact of different parenting styles on the host family. And again, that feeds into how do we communicate that and where do we get support from that? And I will talk a little bit more about that later on. Then we talk about the psychological safety, as Kate said, and actually we've evolved this slightly, that we don't have one Maslow, we have two Maslows, because it's the relational nature of psychological safety. So it's psychological safety for host families as well as Ukrainian families. And at the end, I'm going to put in a third Maslow, but we can think about that more. And then with trauma, one of the things that's come up is that we can talk about trauma in a quite, not a theoretical way, because we try not to use any kind of theoretical language, but it's what do we do with when we're feeling uncomfortable, when we're feeling upset. And I'm talking about the host families here. So one of the things we're developing is some work around emotional regulation. And again, this will be something that hopefully that when we think about running these workshops for Ukrainian families, that this will be something that will be included in that as well. So next slide, Kate. And I will say I think we've run, and Emma, you can put in the chat and tell me I'm wrong, we've run 7 workshops so far, and we've got another one running in January. And this is really what Kate talked about, and what we share with the host families. Thanks, Emma. It is really about preventing breakdown, and to make this the most, a successful relationship. And one of the drivers as well, I think, for the workshop is about creating host communities, so that as much as we're involved in the workshops and in some other places, that actually there is that peer support development. So what came out of the workshops is that host families wanted some follow-up sessions. So what we have been doing is, I think it's about every 6 weeks, we have follow-up, and they're on Zoom because everyone's really, really busy in the evening. And they're a place where host families can come along. And we've been running the workshops in Canterbury and Medway. And because we're trying to bring everyone together, the next invitation will go out to Medway as well as Canterbury. So everyone that's been invited, been on a workshop, will be invited to the follow-up meeting. And that's really, really a place. And the feedback has been incredibly positive. That's been a place where host families can talk about current dilemmas that are coming up for them, but also they share resources. And in the beginning, that was really, really important, and what still is now, setting up bank accounts, education, bus passes, those really practical things. And now, I mean, our last follow-up, we invited Jessica from Kent County Council to come along, because the conversations were really evolving into what happens at, we're coming up to 6 months, what are the resources that are available? What are the things that are in the air that might help us? And that was really, really important. We also in those follow-up sessions were able to draw out from the workshop some of the things that the host families wanted to know more about. So managing difficult conversations comes up quite a lot, trauma, and not just, but just thinking about distress really. And I've used the word maybe trauma incorrectly, really about distress and managing, themselves, but also noticing things that might be going on in their families. And then culture, just thinking about, we are very lucky that in the follow-ups we do have Dennis and Anastasia, 2 Ukrainians who are really able to help us think about differences and similarities, because there are similarities. So this has all been, this follow-up has been driven by the host families, and it is about creating that host community. And as I said, we do invite external partners into those meetings. And this is where those ideas of safeguarding, etc., come in, because from the follow-ups and from the workshops, families, host families and Ukrainian parents have been invited to one-off consultations where they've been very, very specific dilemmas. So I've worked with host families where there have been safeguarding issues, what to do with that. We think there's a safeguarding issue, what to do with that. Another host family I've recently worked with was again wondering how to have a tricky conversation about Christmas. What to do at Christmas. And then with the Ukrainian parent, it was about, one specific was about, seeing her child as a naughty child and not coping. And so we did some work around that, and that was quite a trauma-informed conversation.
Can I just check? You're talking also now about the moving on conversations as well.
Yeah, and the moving on conversations, yeah. So I think one of the things that we've started to talk about, and actually very recently, is not only about this workshop driving support for the host families, but how it can be mirrored both to Ukrainian families and to the professional system. And because when we think about it, we're doing the work with the host family, why not with the Ukrainian families? Why not with the professional system? Because, one influences the other. And so that's kind of going to be our next phase, I think, of conversation and development in Kent. And I think that really by bringing in the three, developing some kind of coherent workshop, some consistent messaging, some shared language, shared understanding, and shared goals, it really does support the kind of humanitarian kind of ethical approach that we want here. And as Kate said, it takes it to the wider community and brings us in together as well.
Well, thank you, Kate and Julie. That's really tremendous. And I don't know if people have been following the chat and the questions, but there's some tremendous issues have been raised. And a number of colleagues, Jenny Gond has brought up a number of issues, including the fact that in Chichester, not far from us in West Sussex, there's quite a large group of hosts. And so one of the questions would be, what are the ways forward in terms of being able to commission some workshops in different parts of the country? Because I suspect there are many. I mean, it's great that the developments are occurring in Kent, and I hope that we'll all be able to continue thinking about developing coherence and a really useful strategy that will encompass both families, the Ukrainian families, the context, and have a much greater community support. But what could you say something about commissioning workshops in other parts of the country?
Absolutely. I would really want to invite people to feel able to do that, and that's why I put my email address on the slides. I hope people have got that. I suppose I could try and write it into the chat, couldn't I? We have got 2 people working in Hampshire who are doing an awful lot in Hampshire, and would, I'm sure, be really happy to. And we have teams all around the country and in Northern Ireland. So please don't hesitate to approach me. Can I say something else? We've also, and some of them are face to face, some of them are online, okay, as Julie said. So it rather depends on what people want and whether it's possible. What I'm aware of, looking at these questions and in the chat, are that we're talking here. A lot of you are hosts,
Yeah,
and a lot of you are hosts with some who are have had quite a lot of challenges, and I'm wondering how we can best respond to some of these. I mean, I did already say that we do have access to some resources. We do. One person, for example, has said, "Well, what do you do if what happens? What happens if your guest's husband is killed?
yeah.
How is that managed? You know, and how do the police come and knock on the door?" Do you know what? I have no idea whether the police come and knock on the door or not. I suspect not, but if you are hosting under the Homes for Ukraine scheme, your area should have support workers who are responsible and should be there to help you. However, I'm really happy for anyone who's written a question here to write to me, and I'm happy to do all that research. But you should, because I know there are all sorts of different issues coming up for people here.
Yeah, I've put mine in as well, Kate, just in case we can field them together.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, what you just said about Kate, about there are lots of host families, and I'd be interested if the host families had been on the workshops at all, or had the opportunity, and what we might be able to do about that.
In Kent, definitely.
Well,
but it looks like
in Kent, but if we did something online.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Can I just say a very interesting question has come up about the issue of Ukrainians. C. Walsh, I think, sorry, not sure of your full name, concerned about Ukrainians currently accommodated in large centres, hesitant about vaccinations. Meningococcal vaccination is not part of the Ukraine schedule. Many are hesitant about accepting something that's not part of their schedule. There's been outbreaks of measles and polio in Ukraine, and we may see an outbreak here. So I think very interesting issue about the information for Ukrainian families about the importance of different schedules. And of course, one of the questions that have come up is also the development of workshops and support for Ukrainian families, a parallel process. And I wonder whether you hope that these might begin to be developed to see how they could work. And the issue of medical care, safeguarding issues, a whole range of issues of what's relevant here, what's relevant for them, might then be picked up. And I think the whole the strength of Zoom linking makes us very possible to go forward in some of these areas. But I wonder if you'd like to comment on groups for Ukrainian families and the importance of that.
Well, I mean, what Julie said was the idea about us moving on from just working with hosts and starting to do more work with groups of Ukrainians. But when I said resources differ from area to area, in many of the areas where I've run workshops, there have been quite a lot of groups for Ukrainians. And that project that we've embarked on, which is to bring hosts together so that they can offer each other support, is happening in a lot of areas for Ukrainians. But I think, you know, the scope for that to happen much more. And it's, I suppose, one of the things we should encourage. But watch, in terms of what we're going to do, watch this space, because I think that's absolutely where we're hoping we can move on to. And some people are already doing that in Hampshire. I see there's some of you, some of the people in Hampshire, in Oxford, some areas are already doing that. So yeah.
One interesting issue which I was just wondering about, because in a sense you're presenting a model. Is it a model of a single workshop, which is a sort of several hours, and then followed up with the Zoom links? Is that the model, or what is, or a number of workshops?
Different groups are doing things differently. Different groups, sorry, it's Zoom, isn't it? You can't interrupt on Zoom. Sorry, Zana, you can't interrupt. Different groups are doing things differently. So we started off with potential, saying we'll deliver 3 workshops. What a lot of groups are doing is delivering one introductory one and then subsequent follow-up ones on Zoom. I've only ever done one set of workshops on Zoom. Most of mine have been face-to-face. I like working face-to-face and I don't mind traveling. So yes, a lot of it's a bit like our work as systemic therapists. We negotiate with the group depending on what comes up. Is that the same for you? It's a bit of a lead follow. So there might be an issue with trauma and distress, and how do we manage that? So that might be a theme for the next workshop. So it's ongoing, and I know you are, and in Hertfordshire, a colleague is working with and giving continuous ongoing support workshops every month, so every 3 weeks. So yeah, people are mentioning Christmas.
Yes, I think Christmas is quite, as Joyce, I think Lothran said, Christmas is a very tricky time now. Normally joyful, extravagant family reunion, not really in tune with what the Ukrainian guests are going through just now. And I think very important,
really hard.
important, and also a lot of different feelings about that.
Yeah.
Someone has asked if they can share the presentation with their local host. By all means, but what I've said is simply a few examples. It might be worth just asking us to come and do a presentation, depending on where you are. If you want, it's Jenny Gond. If you want, do feel free to get in touch. But I don't have a problem with you sharing this presentation. I don't know how it works.
Another point which has been raised in Kent, we hear a lot about Ukrainians distrusting police, citing a lot of corruption, lots of Ukrainians not wishing to see the GP, as they would normally be able to access medication directly from a pharmacy. They want a lot of Ukrainians not continuing with meds for mental health issues and resulting in worsening of mental health. So I think there's some really key issues emerging into cultural and differences, and really this brings up some major issues and how to have an integrated, community-wide and way of actually helping and accessing and managing these very important issues which are coming up.
I should say the Joint Refugee Action Network, JRAN, is at present doing a consultation countrywide with refugee agencies to look at whether they feel a hub would be a useful service. We as an AFT group would be part of that hub. So it would be a hub of resources, because, you know, there's a lot of, everything is very different, and services are being offered very differently in different areas. So to have a hub would be a very useful resource. The uptake of these workshops, somebody's asked about. It's interesting because we've had very variable uptake, Louise, and we've been looking for those people who've had the uptake hasn't been good, we've invited them to look at the way they advertise the workshops, because one of the things we have discovered is that often organisers of hosts, people who look after the hosts of Homes for Ukraine, feel that that there's a bigger need than the hosts themselves feel. That's one thing. Secondly, we've speculated that maybe a lot of hosts don't like a kind of it to have too much of a therapeutic emphasis, and actually, you know, it's the person on top of the Clapham omnibus doesn't necessarily want to be associated with what's seen as a therapy, delivering a therapeutic intervention. So we have tried to make our invitations to hosts much more practical and supportive in a kind of loose way, rather than this is going to be a group therapy session. Just to sort of let you know about that. One team up in Cambridgeshire changed their invitation and went from having very few taking up their invitation to having an awful lot. So it might be worth thinking about that.
Thanks very much. Amanda Drummond, who mentioned this about the issue of reluctance, wonders about the whole managing to develop hubs and, of course, a public health approach. And it's interesting, isn't it, if we think about the way that in certain parts of the country ACEs hubs have developed, really looking at how different areas of the community could work together to deal with serious problems of adversity of childhood and the whole network of responses. And I think the refugee hub, where the different agencies can really begin to develop shared approaches, does seem to make a great deal of sense here, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think that's, and maybe I didn't articulate it in that way, there is something about how can we bring, you know, hosts, Ukrainian families and the professional teams, you know, together, and how do we bring the professional teams around to support hosts and families. Yeah. And I think for everyone, I think we need to be mindful, this is a scheme that for lots of local authorities, the messaging from government hasn't been very clear. There's been a lot of miscommunication, and I think there's such a motivation and a determination now from many people I've spoken to actually do this differently and with each other. That I think that would be a better model. Yeah.
Yes. A point that Jenny Gond makes means that there is guidance for GPs, health screening, but not necessarily being followed, which means really that the messages, the screening, the advice, the rationalization, the reasons needs a much broader approach to really be able to achieve those goals.
Yeah.
So
I'm just looking at some of these to see if there's anything outstanding that we need to respond to. Well, one of the things I should say is if resources, we do hold some resources, and if resources become available under a hub, then there will be potential for, I hope, for people to be able to access these. But one of the things I'm quite keen for us to do is to run workshops, not only for refugee agencies, but for their own service users. Because one of the things I've been trying to collect around us are and Julie mentioned Annette, are trained, are Ukrainians who are trained or are interested in helping their own communities. So and we do know a few of these, but it will be the same with the refugees from any countries, how we help support them, to support their own people. And I think that's an important model to follow.
Yeah.
So David Woodhead has put a very interesting question amongst a number of others, which is really the whole issue of individuation. How can we help guests encouraging them to become self-sufficient, creating an independent life in the UK, not proto-parental. And I think that the whole question of helping families become have their own role and have their own lives here, that process seems to be an important issue, doesn't it? And in terms of how to help people move on.
One of the themes that's come up a lot is how hard it is to help people move on when they are in a limbo themselves. I mean, they're still stuck in that looking to their own home. What does moving on look like? And how can they both hold one part of their life in their homeland while they might be grieving for that, and move on in this? So how they position themselves, the guests, is terribly difficult when they're in that tension, and how we help them do that, I think, is important, to hold that tension of where do I belong, and am I just waiting? A lot of people say their guests are just waiting to go home and think that they will be able to do it as soon as possible. And it's quite hard to move forward in another country when you're just waiting to go back to. So that tension is an issue, I think.
Yeah. And one guest said to me, we're physically safe, but will we ever be emotionally safe? When you have got, 1 foot, or you're looking at home and you're wondering whether your husband's going to live, or your family, you're going to see them again. However, another Ukrainian mum said to me, getting a job, getting a child into education, getting to know the local layout, being able to get on a bus, they've all been really helpful in terms of creating some kind of grounding and stability. And also that host guest relationship has been so incredibly important in that.
Yeah.
Thank you for the offer from Dr. Sarah Temple, is it, or your book? I don't know if people have seen that.
Oh, Sarah Temple, yes, that's very helpful. Sarah's giving a workshop shortly, so she'll be able to, people will be able to hear more about that.
Is there anything else? I'm just thinking, I'm just looking to see if there's anything
Kate, I'm just wondering, there's so much, there are a lot of questions and a lot of issues. I'm just wondering how we respond to that without, I feel like a bit of a responsibility to respond to every question.
I started trying to reply to them all.
I'm just wondering what's going to be the most helpful thing. Is it that we go away and look at the themes and write to everyone that's participated? Is there an email group? Is there something? I don't know.
Well,
I'm just wondering what happens normally.
Yes, well, I think the one thing that's going to happen is that we can arrange for the lists of questions to be put together, and we will try to get the emails of those who put the questions to us, so that you can pick that up. You've given your emails, and hopefully people will begin to network. The recording of this particular session is going to be available in the next few days to people, and your slides will be attached to that. And I'm very much encourage our colleagues to be in touch with you. And a colleague from Sladziana Radulovic, majority Ukrainians celebrate Christmas on the 7th of January.
Yeah.
So that's an important piece of information. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
That's helpful. You see, that's interesting as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think the point you made about working with our Ukrainian colleagues here, and I know that our colleague Valerie Sinison has regular links with Ukrainian psychotherapists, in fact, by the magic of Zoom. So I think creating a network, beginning to build up connections, which is so important, is perhaps the way forward. Well, I'm going to bring the session to an end now, and I want to thank Julie and Kate, for your presentation. We look forward to having the slides to look at and also being able to access and to listen to the presentation again. So many valuable points that are raised. I did want to mention, just before we finish, to say that the next seminar will be given by Dr. Sarah Temple, who's been participating in this one, which is great, and that she's going to give a presentation on the Tuesday, the 31st of January at 5:15. She's going to be drawing on her experience as a GP to share a neurodiversity trauma-informed approach to wellness. Look forward to that. On the 28th of Feb, David Trickey, UK Trauma Council co-director, links with the Anna Freud, is going to be presenting on identifying and responding effectively to traumatic bereavement. Such an important topic, and so important to many of the families here, sadly, because of the extreme experiences to which they will have been exposed in their families at home. On the 28th of March, Tuesday 28th of March, Jeanne Wollstonecroft, who's a research fellow at GOS, UCL Population Policy, is going to be talking about the Imagine project, which is a large-scale study of children with genetic issues, children with intellectual disability, and she's going to be speaking about the interesting theme of he's been in lockdown since he was born, an exploration of the experiences of families facing the stress and adversity associated with caring for children with intellectual disability during COVID. Tremendous area of stress. And I just remind you of our seminars on trauma and looked after children throughout March. And we're very actively looking for other presentations and other briefing seminars because we feel it's so important that these themes should be aired and shared. Thank you, David. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, colleagues, for your positive thanks and noting that this has been an interesting and helpful session. So thank you all very much indeed. So
thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, everybody.
Find out more about becoming an ACAM member and to be part of the advancement of child and adolescent mental health. Visit www.acamh.org.